Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Yakud Yeshua. Today's topic is going to start off in Matthew chapter 23, verse 23, reading from the New King James Version. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. So, reading this verse, it brings a question to my mind. This is Yeshua speaking here. So, what does he mean when it says the weightier matters of the law, right? So what does it mean by to be weightier? So, to illustrate this point, I have an example. See, this is a little bouncy ball. Now, let's just pretend that this bouncy ball represents one verse, right? So if we say that each ball represents one verse, if I show you this container with 10 in it, and then I show you this container with only 5 in it, which of these would you say is weightier? Well, the one with 10 in it is weightier. You can see it's much more, it's physically heavier in this example. And so this is one way of looking at things in Scripture, is that the more verses there are on a certain subject, the weightier it is, right? So if there's 10 verses on something versus 5 verses on something, the topic that has 10 verses is more important. Now let me run you through an example. For my example, I like to compare the crucifixion and the resurrection of Christ, at least here in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, the crucifixion in the Gospel of Matthew really starts about chapter 27, verse 35. So not counting the ordeal before he was on the cross. And if you were writing a play, the scene would close right about verse 56. Now, for the resurrection, it starts in chapter 28, verse 1, and once again, the scene really closes at verse 15. So if we were to compare these two, you would note that there is 21 verses about the crucifixion and 15 verses about the resurrection. And for me, that's an important note, that clearly in the Gospel of Matthew there was more time, that is to say more words, more verses dedicated to the crucifixion than there was to the resurrection. And you'll find a similar pattern throughout all of Scripture, that the crucifixion is spoken about more, that is to say his death, and there is much more detail given to the death on the cross than there is given to the resurrection. And that's just an interesting note, but that's one way of looking at things. However, that isn't the only way of looking at things. So let's go back to the original verse and have a different way of determining the weightier matters. Going back to Matthew 23:23, there is an interesting thing about this verse. Now, what it says is that you tithe mint and anise and cumin and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith, in the King James Version now. So when you come across something like this is an outright statement, right? And so when you have an outright statement that judgment, mercy, and faith are more important than tithing mint and anise and cumin, so from this verse, you could clearly make a determination, using this verse in and of itself, that judgment, mercy, and faith is more important than tithing. And you'll find a lot of different other examples of this same kind of principle. So another verse I like to look at If you want to know, well, what's really important in Scripture? Well, if you go and look at Micah 6:8, it says, "He has shown thee, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of thee, but to to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with thy God." And you see, once again, you see a verse like this, and it's showing you, hey, wait a second, this is what is required, right? And so this verse is very important, and you'll find this in Scripture. So, like I said before, you could look at things by how much is written about it, but there are certain subjects that not very much is written about. However, if you look at the language in the verse, it'll quite often tell you, hey, this is really important. Hey, you should have been doing this. And that's another way of looking at things, of what's important, what's weightier. So the purpose of this video is just to kind of, if you're not aware of these things, give you a way of studying Scripture, give you a way of determining, what things are really important without getting into, rabbit trails and, fine details that really aren't super important to the everyday living and the walk and big Bible concepts. So with that, there is the natural question, what is the most important thing in the Bible? And arguably, using both of these methods, the most important topic and the most talked about thing in Scripture, what's the most important thing? Well, that's right. You guessed it. Jesus, right? The answer is always Jesus. That's a Christian joke. But, most of Scripture is about Yeshua. And if you can't find Yeshua in every book of the Bible, well, you probably need to work a little bit harder at trying to find him in there, because he's all over the place. But a lot of it's written about him. I mean, you have the 4 Gospels dedicated directly to his actions, and it's, the 4 Gospels are kind of unique in that aspect, where they're 4 accounts of, his life, whereas in every other part of Scripture you have like the accounting of David. You don't have a lot of repetition of events during David's life, or repetition of, like the life of Samuel, for example, or the life of Elijah, for example. So I hope this helps you in your studies, and I hope you learned a new perspective on how to look at things. This has been Yakid Yeshua, and I hope you have a blessed day.